Chapter 5. One cold night in Men's ward, Petey lay awake. As the furnace roared, he strained to look sideways at the dim reflection on his wheelchair. Something had moved. He'd seen something move. Squirming and twisting, Petey struggled to see it directly. Again, something moved, but as Petey searched the dim reaches of the glow, the heater kicked off and left the room in still darkness. Now Petey heard something, a faint scratching sound on the sheet covering his wheelchair. He stared into the black nothingness, afraid but excited. 5 minutes he waited, his heart pounding. With a click and a roar, the furnace billowed back to life, flickering dim light back across the wheelchair. Petey jerked wildly in a triggered reaction. 3 little fuzzy creatures scattered, but not before being identified. Mice. At Infant's Ward, Petey had seen mice and heard nurses and aides talk about them, but never this close. They were tiny, but scurried about so fast. Soon the mice ventured back onto the wheelchair. Unconcerned about the roaring furnace 10 feet above them, they sniffed and poked their little whiskered noses into every fold of the sheet, searching for tidbits of food. For several hours, Petey watched the 3 mice. The large one, with the huge elephant ears, he named William, the name of an attendant he remembered from Infant's Ward. The 2 smaller mice could have been brother and sister, one gray, the other black. They became Cloud and Blackie. After the first few nights, Petey hoped for cold weather so he could watch his little friends by the furnace light. He also started guarding pieces of food which fell on his sheet at mealtime. Flapping his arms, he caused crumbs and chunks to settle between the folds, hiding them from the attendant. If the day's food storage had not gone well because an attendant brushed off his sheets, Petey mysteriously broke into a coughing spell, spewing food all over his cover sheet. It became a delicate art. If he coughed too hard, they exchanged his sheet with a clean one. By mid-November, the furnace kicked on regularly, allowing Petey to watch his tiny fuzzy friends every night. 2 more mice joined the nightly gathering. One fat gray mouse he called Sally. Another gray one with huge whiskers endeared himself to Petey from the very start. After eating, the mouse crossed over from the wheelchair and curled up against Petey's warm body. Eventually, he spent whole nights. Petey named him Esteban. A week passed before a new gray mouse with dark patches showed up on the wheelchair. Reluctant and scared, he fled every time the furnace kicked in. Petey named him Patches. Within a few days, Patches became a regular. Petey grew concerned for Sally. She had grown fat and clumsy. One night, she failed to appear. Late into the night, Petey lay awake. He watched the other mice. Patches kept running from one bit of food to the next, satisfying his curiosity more than his hunger. As usual, Esteban had crossed over to the bed and curled up near Petey's side, asleep. What could have happened to Sally? The following night, Sally climbed slowly up the wheel, an hour after the rest started feeding. Petey smiled broadly. Sally, she was okay. She didn't look as bloated, but appeared weak. She fed determinedly for a short while and then scurried away. Her actions puzzled Petey. For several weeks, Sally came only for short visits. One night, Petey heard an odd frenzy of faint squeaks. When the furnace finally kicked on, the light exposed Sally, complete with her litter of 5 tiny babies. Sally climbed deftly up the wheel, leaving the little mice crying and bumping into each other, trying to follow. One wheel had quite a bit of rough tread left. The other was worn smooth. Petey watched the baby mice work to climb the smooth tire their mother had clambered up so easily. They clawed their way up a few inches, then fell. If one made progress, another crawled up behind and grabbed its tail, sending both tumbling to the floor. Meanwhile, Sally nibbled away, unconcerned. The smartest of the 5 babies never had a chance. Shoved aside and crowded out, the runt finally wandered across the open floor to the other tire and clawed his way successfully up to the treaded wheel. By the time he had reached the top, the other babies discovered the secret and ran over to follow. Petey watched, grinning, as the teeny rascals scrambled about. He had more friends. As winter settled, hard, bitter cold pierced the very heart of the ward. The furnace running full time failed to repel the icy fingers. Petey knew the winter had arrived for good when he heard the attendants and nurses wish each other Merry Christmas. He dreaded Christmas, because nobody wanted to work then. Petey knew he would have to lie for hours in his waist before attendants had time to change the sheet under him. By January, Petey's host of friends became an even dozen. Sally's babies grew, and Petey became a very messy eater. In mid-January, a new patient arrived on the ward. The attendants brought a 9-year-old boy over from the hospital in a wheelchair. They had discovered Calvin Anders, bruised and half-naked, abandoned on the front steps of the administration building during a snowstorm. He had been shivering and whimpering beside one of the large marble pillars. Mildly retarded with severe club feet, Calvin cowered from everyone. Maybe because of their age or because of their wheelchairs, Petey and Calvin fascinated each other. At the ages of 9 and 12, they were the only children in an otherwise adult ward. Calvin sat for hours staring over at Petey and his wheelchair. His third day on the ward, Calvin scrapped together his courage and headed his wheelchair toward Petey's corner of the room. Once in motion, Calvin was not a good driver. Twice he bumped into patients blocking his path. When they swore at him, Calvin grimaced and ducked his head as if avoiding stones. Petey watched Calvin intently as he approached. "You been here long?" Calvin asked in a scared whisper. Petey stared for a while and nodded his head up and down, testing the old skill. Calvin struggled to position his wheelchair in front of Petey, then looked up and down at him. He stared hard at the odd shapes under Petey's cover sheet. "What's wrong with you?" he whispered, scratching his black tousled hair. Petey stared helplessly. "Can't you talk?" Petey shook his head. "You had an accident, didn't you?" Petey thought a moment. It was an accident of nature that made him this way. Hesitantly, he jerked his chin in a nod. He smiled with excitement. For the first time in years, he had communicated. "Let's be friends," Calvin blurted, bouncing his chubby body up and down. Again, Petey jerked his head in a nod, smiling. Throwing away the last of his caution, Calvin blurted, "I can get my bed moved over near yours. Is that okay?" Petey grinned, nodding. Calvin quickly learned Petey's name. Never taking no for an answer, he badgered every attendant or nurse who worked at the ward. Finally, he found one willing to arrange for him to sleep near Petey. The first night sounded like two children at a slumber party. Calvin kept whispering in the dark while Petey smiled and grunted acknowledgement. Twice, Blackie and Patches tried to approach the wheelchair, but the talking scared them away. Petey couldn't wait to show Calvin his small friends. Late that night, before he fell asleep, he remembered seeing Sally, Cloud, and Esteban crawl up the wheelchair to eat. Once during the night, he awoke to find Esteban curled next to his cheek. The little whiskers tickled him, and Petey smiled. Life was wonderful. The next few weeks brimmed with discovery. Calvin, true to his nature, pestered the attendants until they pulled Petey next to the windows. Petey grinned and flailed his arms to show his approval. Time spent with Calvin triggered dreams for Petey. He dreamed of playing with two children, one girl, the other a boy. The dreams were so real. The vocabulary between Petey and Calvin also grew each day. Instead of simple nods, Petey's gestures became more subtle. A frown or smirk, the twitch of an eye, a wrinkled forehead. Every gesture became tethered to a thread of woven into a larger tapestry. To help matters, Calvin slowly learned to ask questions that could be answered with a yes or no. Petey tried to tell Calvin about his friends, the mice. Nothing made sense, though. After several days of gesturing, Petey finally gave up. One morning, a week later, Calvin rolled over to Petey after breakfast. "Hey, Petey," he said with his high-pitched, squeaky voice. "You should have seen all the mice on your wheelchair last night. I woke up and could see them in the light from the heater. There was a whole bunch." Petey broke into a huge smile and nodded his head. "Aye, aye," he squealed. Looking up at the furnace and down at the floor, he flapped his arms in glee. "That's what you were telling me last week, wasn't it?" Calvin asked. Petey smiled again and squealed. "Aye, aye." "Maybe we can catch one," Calvin added. Calvin's words caught Petey by surprise. He scowled, shaking his head no. Oh, he growled. "We'll see," Calvin said mischievously. That night, Calvin and Petey waited for the mice to come. Petey had been quite successful during supper at being messy. Shortly after the lights went out, the parade of mice began. First came Sally's 5 youngsters, followed by Sally herself. Next came the new gray mouse that Petey had named Sun. William and Cloud showed up about the same time over opposite sides of the chair. Then came Esteban, Blackie, and last of all, Patches. After a half an hour of eating, Esteban crossed over to the bed and curled up next to Petey. Calvin could be seen blinking hard at the spectacle. Petey was prepared to flail his arms and grunt loudly if Calvin tried to catch or hurt any of his friends. The next morning, Calvin jabbered ecstatically. "You're actually friends with them, aren't you?" "Aye, aye," Petey cried. "What's all the racket, boys?" the attendant Scully asked as he approached. Both boys looked up with guilty stares, their secret intact. First, the attendant helped Calvin get dressed and into his wheelchair. After sending him over for breakfast in the day room, he turned to Petey. "Okay, you're next." Reaching down to start cleaning, his eyes fell on Petey's cover sheet. He shouted over his shoulder, "Hey, Ed, come here a second." The other attendant walked over. "What is it?" "Look at this." Scully pulled off the sheet and roughly shook away the mouse droppings. "We need some rat poison." Chapter 6. As Petey was wheeled over to the day room for breakfast, his mind raced. He knew what poison meant from the idle talk overheard in infant's ward, but he had no idea what poison looked like. The attendant's hard shakes of the sheet, however, made it clear the mice would not be tolerated. Waiting for food, Petey sat with his head angled sharply over to the left, as if frozen at the end of his stretch. Somehow, he had to keep the food off his sheet. Opening his mouth extra wide, he concentrated on each bite. Desperately, he curled his lips around the food. His enormous effort was not entirely successful, choking and gagging on the trapped food. He finally wrenched his head sideways and spewed a mouthful all over the floor. Some hit the attendant. "Knock that off," the man bellowed. "You act like you've never eaten before." Petey curled his lips inward and examined the sheet. Although still hungry, he decided not to push his luck. He closed his mouth to the next bite and shook his head back and forth. "Okay, suits me," the attendant declared, shoving back from the table. All morning, Petey tried to communicate his problem to Calvin, but the concept was too complicated. What gestures explained that rat poison or mouse droppings? Finally, he gave up in hopeless despair and ignored Calvin's probing questions. Calvin rolled away to a different window. By supper, Petey was so hungry he had to eat something. Twice, his coughing spells sprayed food in every direction. After the meal, he inspected his sheet. Several large food bits lay scattered near his waist. He flung his arms and twisted his body. The food bits moved, but fell against his legs where he could force no motion. All evening he stared down at the morsels, each one representing the death to his tiny friends. When at last the attendant lifted him onto his bed for the night, Petey was exhausted. The day's efforts only made the upcoming vigil more torturous. As the light switched off, Petey listened in the dark for any sound of his friends. Once a faint shuffle sounded on the hard floor and Petey convulsed his body. The sound disappeared. When the furnace first kicked on, he saw William nosing his whiskers over the edge of the chair. Petey flailed his arms wildly and watched his friend scamper away. 3 more times during the night, he grunted and struggled against sounds from the darkness. Finally, Petey could no longer keep his eyes open and submitted to his weariness. He slept until the furnace roared to life and jarred him awake. Skimming his eyes back and forth across the sheet, Petey sighed with relief. He spotted no movement. Then he looked down in horror. A furry little pile had curled up next to his leg. "Esteban!" Petey watched the small mouse for several minutes. Esteban cuddled closer and tucked his tiny nose between his feet. Twice Petey tried to strike out at his friend, but his body froze and refused to act. Esteban trusted him and would not understand this act of betrayal. Petey's feelings tore at his conscience. Any further stillness condemned Esteban to death. Finally, with a sudden jerk, Petey closed his eyes and brought his arms crashing against his leg near where the little mouse slept. Esteban scrambled frantically out of his cozy nest as Petey's arms pummeled him, sending him tumbling to the floor. Petey let out a pinched cry and continued flailing his bent arms in a frenzy. He kept his eyes closed. One bed away, Calvin had awakened to find Petey lashing out at the mouse that had so often cuddled near his side. Even after the little mouse hit the floor and scurried away, Calvin watched Petey whip his arms up and down, eyes closed tightly in a grimace. The next morning wake-up call came like a sentry, relieving Petey of duty. Light snow flecked against the dirty window panes. Petey was glad not having to get up. Before he closed his eyes to sleep again, he looked over at the large melting droplets creeping their way down the glass. They were huge teardrops that refused to stop. The bright ceiling lights and the attendant's grating voice kept clawing Petey rudely from his sleep. His body felt heavy with fatigue and retreated back into a stuporous slumber. The rough shake of a hand jarred Petey. "Hey, guy, join the living." Petey stared morosely as the attendant stripped his blanket off and rolled him over for cleaning. All day, Petey heard no mention made of mice or poison, but he knew all the attendants needed was a reminder. Except at feeding time, Petey slept soundly in his chair. Calvin tried unsuccessfully to ask Petey about his actions the night before. Petey closed his eyes, too exhausted to answer. The bedlam raising from the ward blanketed his sleep, and not until supper did Petey open his eyes and gaze dully about the room. Patients moved past, conducting themselves with their usual confusing movements and unknown intentions. Calvin sat across the ward, staring into space. Petey watched him, wishing somehow he could explain the problem. Finally, Calvin broke from his fixed gaze and turned to look. Petey smiled to show friendship. Hesitantly, Calvin wheeled himself across the board. "Hey, Petey, are you awake?" he asked as he came near. Aye. Why are you mad at me?" Oh. You mean you ain't mad at me? Oh. Then how come you wouldn't talk to me this morning? And why did you chase the mouse off your bed last night? Why did you sleep all day?" Petey looked back at Calvin with a helpless stare. He pleaded for questions he could answer. "I know, you can't tell me," Calvin reminded himself. "Not unless I can guess, huh?" Petey nodded. For several minutes they regarded each other before Calvin spoke. "Okay, then, let me try." He wrinkled his forehead and puzzled. His little club feet strained inward as if to aid the effort. "Did you hit the mouse 'cause he did something to you?" "Oh." "Are you mad at him?" Oh. Then why did you swing at the mouse?" Petey gave Calvin a look of reproach. Okay. Were you helping the mouse?" Petey broke into a smile. Aye. "Petey, you're screwy. You don't help a mouse by hitting it." Petey nodded his head insistently. "Petey, I don't understand." Again Calvin sat, puzzling for some time before he spoke again. "Were you trying to chase it away?" Petey nodded. "Were you trying to help the mouse by chasing it away?" Aye. That doesn't make sense." Petey sat helpless. "Was something going to hurt the mouse?" Calvin ventured. Petey nodded his head eagerly. Aye. "What was going to hurt him?" Petey stared. "Was it someone?" "Aye." "Who?" Petey frowned and shifted his eyes over towards the nurse's station. "They were going to hurt the mice. The attendants?" "Aye. How could they hurt the mice?" Petey could only stare at Calvin. "Were they going to put mouse traps?" Petey thought for a moment. Calvin almost had the answer in his hand. If he said no, Calvin might give up, and they would never return within the reach of a proper answer. But Petey trusted Calvin's persistence and felt certain he would not give up. Petey bet everything on his reply. Oh. You mean they were going to hurt the mice, but they weren't going to set mouse traps?" "Aye. Petey, you're really screwy. They can't hurt mice if they don't set mouse traps." Now Petey worried. Maybe Calvin didn't know about poison. He looked at Calvin with a pleading look, begging him to keep trying. "How else can they hurt mice, Petey?" Petey waited silently. Calvin bit his lip and scratched both sides of his head. Finally he threw his arms up. "I don't know. Maybe with poison." Petey jerked his arms wildly. His face lit up with a smile and squealed his answer. Aye. They're going to use poison? They said that?" "Aye." Petey jerked his head, chin up and down. His excitement went beyond the poison. Today he had successfully communicated a thought. He had broken through the invincible barrier guarding his mind.